All right. Thank you. Thank all of you in person and as well as online who are still with us. I'd like to turn now to our last topic and really focus the discussion back on some of the main concepts of FOIP or the main elements of FOIP by focusing on the economic domain. As not as a surprise, the title of our second panel, therefore, is The Economic Dimensions of FOIP, Competition or Cooperation. For this, we've assembled another excellent group of experts to lead us through the discussion. And once again, let me take a moment to introduce each of them in the order that they'll be speaking, and you can look online for a much larger biography for each of them. First up is my colleague at RAND, Dr. Howard Schatz, who's a senior economist at the RAND Corporation and a professor at the Pardee RAND Graduate School. Dr. Schatz specializes in international economics, and his research has included U.S. international economic strategy, economic competition, and the U.S. role in the global economic order. From 2007 to 2008, Dr. Schatz was on leave from RAND so he could serve as a senior economist on the U.S. President's Council of Economic Advisors. Next, we will hear from Ms. Shihoko Goto, who is the director for the Asia Program and director for the Geoeconomics and Indo-Pacific Enterprise at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. A seasoned journalist and analyst, Ms. Goto has reported from Tokyo and Washington for Dow Jones and UPI on the global economy, international trade, and Asian markets. She has also been a columnist for the Diplomat magazine and contributing editor to The Globalist. And subsequent to those, she was a donor country relations officer for the World Bank. Our final speaker will be Mr. Kunihiko Shinoda, who is a professor and executive advisor at the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS. Mr. Shinoda has a long career in the field, joining Japan's Ministry of International Trade and Industry and holding several leadership positions therein, such as Director for the Financial Cooperations Division in the Trade and Economic Cooperation Bureau, Director for the Asia and Pacific Division in the Trade Policy Bureau, and Deputy Director General for the Trade Policy in Trade Policy Bureau, among others. Mr. Shinoda was also engaged in negotiations on free trade agreements, such as RCEP, and economic cooperation with ASEAN, China, and India. He was seconded to GRIPS in 2019, where he became a professor in 2022. So with that, let me get started, and I'll start with my colleague, Dr. Schatz.
Thank you, Dr. Horning, and special thanks to Consul General Sone and President Kaifu for hosting us in this very lovely facility. My topic today is going to be the United States and Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific effort. And I'm going to look at 4 questions. First is, how does the United States evaluate the economic dimension of Japan's FOIP? And then I'm going to move to, well, what is the U.S. economic strategy in the Indo-Pacific? Both of them, you'll find, have a certain component of development assistance. So I want to talk about what the U.S. is doing in terms of development assistance in the region. And then, as you saw from the discussion this morning and from the consuls general, I'm going to talk about U.S. policy towards China, because China is really the big element or a big element driving all of this. So let me start with, how does the U.S. evaluate the FOIP? One of the great things about doing this is I learned that the FOIP originated in Japan. Now my first car that I ever bought on my own was a Toyota, a long time ago, 100% made in Japan. I drive a Nissan now, which is mostly made in Canada, US, and Mexico. And I think this is a good way to think about how the US views Japan's FOIP: import and localize. And there's a tremendous amount of overlap between what the U.S. is, how the U.S. views the Indo-Pacific and Japan's FOIP, but not completely. Let me go to the economics of Japan's FOIP, the major pillars. So in terms of economics, pillar 1, rules for prosperity, right? A rule-based order for prosperity is I would say one of the most important economic aspects of Japan's FOIP. Pillar 3, multi-layered connectivity. Those are what I'd say are major economic measures. Minor economic measures, because economics is always in everything, right? Handling challenges the Indo-Pacific way, so the global commons. Less economics, but it's something. And then pillar 4, safe use of the sea and the air. And then there's cooperation methods. This is also part of Japan's FOIP. And that's official development assistance, capital mobilization, attention to India. All right. And I'd add that with pillar 3, there's a focus on Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Pacific Islands. So what is the US doing with this? Let me jump straight to pillar 3. Yes, connectivity. We're very close on connectivity, right? So while the US doesn't say we are following Japan's FOIP, you can see the countries are aligned on connectivity. Pillars 2 and 4, the global commons, and those are pretty close also. And the cooperation methods, all official development assistance, capital mobilization, also very close. Where we really differ, and this was talked about in the morning, and we'll talk about it some more, where we really differ is pillar 1, rules for prosperity, because Japan is talking about using and strengthening the WTO, the CPTPP, formal trade agreements, an EPA with Bangladesh, an economic partnership agreement with Bangladesh. For now, and since 2017, late 2016, really, any kind of market access agreement has been off the table in the United States. So we're approaching the rules of international trade quite differently from Japan. Right? Otherwise, there's a pretty significant amount of overlap, and the US, I would say de facto, not by statement, views Japan's FOIP very favorably to the effect that we took the language, we imported the language. Right? Now, so that's Japan's strategy towards the Indo-Pacific, the free and open Indo-Pacific. What is the US strategy? How are we approaching the Indo-Pacific? Well, there are 3 guiding documents to think about with the Indo-Pacific. One is the National Security Strategy from 2022. And the language is going to sound very familiar to what you've been hearing about Japan's FOIP. We want an open, interconnected, prosperous, secure, resilient Indo-Pacific with a centrality for ASEAN centrality, again, tremendous overlap, some focus on the Pacific Islands. Again, Japan is doing that, and connectivity, right? That's kind of the guiding document. Well, after that came out, it might have even been before because they were being written in parallel, we had a US Indo-Pacific strategy. Again, that parallels a lot of what the other documents say, free and open region. And now we get to the people aspect, a free and open region where people, individuals live in open societies. So there's a people component for the US too. Countries make independent choices free of coercion. And regional problems are dealt with openly, rules are reached transparently and applied fairly, and goods, ideas, and people flow freely. Embedded within the economics of that are for the US to mobilize new resources to the region, right? That could be private investment, it could be official development assistance. For the prosperity aspect, that's IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity. And that's the 3rd guiding document for the United States. And that's where the United States is putting almost all of its efforts in the economic realm in the Indo-Pacific. What does that involve? Well, it was announced May 2022. I hope I have the date right. And it was the US plus 13 countries. And there were 4 pillars. There are a lot of pillars. We've been talking about pillars all day. I'm sorry if we're getting all the pillars mixed up. It will make for a very, very strong building that might be hard to navigate through with all the pillars, but we can do it. Pillar number 1 was trade. Right. Pillar number 2 was supply chain resilience. Pillar number 3, and here's where you find something of a difference between Japan's FOIP and the US IPEF. Pillar number 3 was clean energy, decarbonization, and infrastructure to that effect. Now, Japan's doing that too, that's important, but the United States has elevated that, right? And it really is something that this administration in particular has elevated far above many other policies. And finally, again, there's overlap, but more of a focus by the US, governance, really tax evasion, tax havens, and anti-corruption. There's been some progress with this. Okay. One of the things I would go back to, and what many people view as the weakness, is pillar one, the trade pillar. And you'll hear the US will say, we want a new model of trade agreements. We want a 21st century model, old agreements with market access, exactly the agreements that Japan, Canada, the United Kingdom, China, Australia, ASEAN are pursuing, are apparently outdated. That's 20th century. We want to move to a 21st century model, which still involves rules, still involves agreements, but other countries aren't necessarily buying it so well, right? That kind of is viewed as the weakness. And there is some justification for what the US says, because a lot of the globalization, again, this administration explaining, the old model left workers and businesses vulnerable and led to fragile supply chains, right? Not wrong, but the question is, how do you solve that? So there has been a lot of progress with the IPEF. Pillar 2, supply chains, the agreement has been completed and signed. That was signed in early 2023. Pillars 3 and 4, the agreements have been completed. They were completed by November. They have not yet been signed. And I think there's going to be an effort in 2024 before the administration ends to get those signed as well. The other hitch with this is that they will be executive agreements. The US Constitution gives Congress the right of regulating foreign trade. It is not clear these agreements will go to congressional vote, and therefore their longevity may be fragile. That's the kind of parallel we saw with the nuclear agreement with Iran. It did not go to Senate vote. It was very fragile, easy to stop, right? So you've got, kind of very big issues, supply chains, trade, environment. A small piece of this is development assistance. And for Japan, for the Japan FOIP, development assistance is very important. I would say, everything we're seeing with BRI, with China's Belt and Road, with infrastructure, Japan was really there first. Japan in Southeast Asia in the 60s just made tremendous advances with infrastructure. And I think it was healthier for the region because it really linked Southeast Asia and other Asian countries into production chains rather than into chains of exporting raw materials for someone else's production. So development assistance is important for Japan, important for the United States. And it goes back before this administration. In 2018, seeing the challenge in Asia, Congress passed something called the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, which said, we want the State Department and USAID and others to promote US security interests, to promote US economic interests, and to promote US democratic values, including human rights and good governance. That is now overlaid on the US Indo-Pacific strategy. And so State Department is budgeting that. They're mixed together. And between fiscal years 19 and fiscal years 23, about $8.4 billion have gone to 24 countries, 6 regional groupings. And so far, the biggest recipients have been Bangladesh, Philippines, and Vietnam, but it's gone throughout the region. And it's gone to all of the purposes that were mentioned. A significant part has gone to economics and to health. And that's a kind of segue. Colleagues and I did some work on comparing US development assistance to what China is doing in Belt and Road. And in some ways, they're not comparable. China doesn't do development assistance. They do finance and development in developing countries. But the US has a very broad, diversified portfolio for its assistance. We fund health, we fund governance, right? We do things that most countries don't do. And you need to include that in the balance. And so the money towards health, the money towards education and social services is all part of US assistance to the Indo-Pacific and is part of the broader US strategy. Let me conclude with what the US is doing with China, what our policy towards China is. So we have to start with the national security strategy. And the reason we have to start with that is the language in the national security strategy regarding our economic stance towards China is repeated in almost every document, every speech, and every readout of a meeting. And that is a three-pronged strategy. Number one, invest at home. Number two, align with allies and partners. And then number three, compete responsibly, defend US interests, and build a US vision for the future. So that's the fundamental approach to China. But what does this really mean? Well, in some ways, the US is not investing in building an economic relationship with China. After the Xi-Biden meeting in Bali, we started economic and financial working groups with them. There's tremendous dialogue, right? And efforts to resolve problems. But we're not in an era now when the US is saying, how can we strengthen our economic relationship? How can we integrate our economies? How can we get the most out of this? It's more to the point where the US is building these relationships with everybody else and and recognizing that they don't want to disrupt the US-China economic relationship. So letting it evolve as is, but also safeguarding US interests when it comes to security. So for example, by putting on very selective export controls and generally pushing back against China for its violations of rules such as theft of intellectual property. So the invest, align, compete formula is important. US is not seeking to decouple, but it's not seeking to build either. Let me conclude with some final thoughts, implications from this. So US and Japan ultimately in some areas will still compete with each other. US companies compete with Japanese companies, right? That's natural. That's what countries do, no matter how close they are, right? But there is significant overlap regarding the Indo-Pacific in language, goals, and methods, right? And part of this is that both are confronted by China's rise, by China's unique economic system, by its expansive goals, and by the risk that it could actually change things for the worse for many countries. What they do differently, and what is very nice about Japan having started the language of the FOIP and the US and many other countries taking it, is it does two things. First, it recognizes that other countries have choices, right? And so this goes back to Japan's inclusivity, and where the US is moving in that direction too. Other countries have choices, don't necessarily make them choose, but recognize that they must be accounted for. The second is to me more interesting, which is that, again, building off the FOIP and now other countries, we're presenting a positive vision for the Indo-Pacific and recognizing that no country can go it alone. And so I think that you know, there's continued incentive to work in this direction because more and more countries are joining on to such a vision. Thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to Consul General Sone, to the Japan House President Kai-Fu for inviting me, allowing us to have this conversation today. Rand and Jeffrey in particular, thank you so much for inviting me personally to be part of the conversation. If I may, I'd like to start first of all with a few words about where I work. The Wilson Center is a think tank that's based in Washington, D.C. It was established in 1968 as an act of Congress. And in 1977, the Wilson Center established the Asia program, which I lead today. On March 20th, the Asia program will be renamed to the Indo-Pacific program. And that's not simply a cosmetic issue, it is a recognition about the importance of the Indo-Pacific and also the ability for the Indo-Pacific to be a force unifier. I think Consul General Sone really described it succinctly. It is an adaptable strategy. It is something that allows countries to come together And this isn't simply on the diplomatic or the political front, it is also on the economic front as well. And so my task today is to talk about Japan's economic interests and strategy in the Indo-Pacific. And I really want to highlight 3 points. First of all, of course, the free and open Indo-Pacific has allowed Japan to emerge as a global stabilizer at a time when we are facing a great deal of uncertainty. And this is true in the economic realm as well. Japan's goal in a nutshell would be to establish a rules-based economic order that is reflecting the interests of the Indo-Pacific partners and allies. The most obvious way to do so is, of course, through the development of trade rules. And we've already spent a great deal of time today talking about CPTPP in particular. But I do want to remind ourselves that Japan wasn't always the most obvious country to take the lead in this incredibly ambitious trade agreement. Of course, Japan was the last country amongst the 12 to join the TPP in 2016. And then when the United States withdrew from the TPP in 2017, there was no guarantee at that time that the TPP would continue. The expectation at that time was that the TPP would actually collapse. In 2017, the Japanese government officials were really working hard behind the scenes, both in Tokyo and in the other capitals, as well as in Washington, to see whether this trade agreement could actually move forward without the United States. And they came to the United States in 2017, not because they were trying to persuade the United States to reconsider, although of course that was one of the goals, but it was another opportunity too for the Japanese to sound out whether there would be backlash from the Trump administration should the Japanese continue to pursue the TPP without them. That was not the case. And it gave Japan a great deal of confidence to be able to push forward together with some key countries, including Australia and New Zealand in particular, to push through the CPTPP. Now, the goal of the CPTPP is always going to be expansion, right? To encourage other countries to be part of the rulemaking order. And I do also want to point out that for Japan to be seen as a rule-making champion is also not something that was obvious. Remember that this was an opportunity for Japan to actually evolve. Until then, Japan had been seen more as a rule breaker. And with TPP onwards, and today with CPTPP and other rules, it has emerged as a rule maker. And one of the reasons why then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe made a political and diplomatic as well as economic case for Japan to join the TPP in the first place was to say this was Japan's last chance to be part of the rule-making order and actually be part of the rule-setting countries and to be relevant and to remain relevant in the international economic order as well. So I do want to point that out. The second point I want to make is that FOIP has actually been it's also been an opportunity for Japan to remain committed to economic multilateralism through the lens of the economic realm. And yes, Japan played a key role in ensuring that CPTPP came to the finishing line, but at the same time, it was a member of RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. It also took time to be part of bilateral agreements with the EU, as well as being the country that was the first to have a bilateral trade agreement with the UK post-Brexit as well. And the Brexit, post-Brexit UK commitment to the Indo-Pacific was also reflected in the fact that the UK also expressed interest in joining the CPTPP. And we should bear in mind that Japan played a key role in ensuring that the UK would actually be able to go through the accession process for that. And Japan has also played a key role in keeping IPEF on the road as well. Of course, this is a US economic agreement, as Howard said previously. But, and I should also say that IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework under the Biden administration, is not and never can be a substitute for CPTPP. But it has allowed Japan to play a key role to ensure that some key Southeast Asian countries that might have otherwise not been part of IPEF to actually join the framework as well. Another point that I want to make is about Japan's commitment to continue to invest in the global South. As Howard said, again, Japan has had a long established track record and presence in Southeast Asia. And we should note that through BRI and other mechanisms, China is really stepping up investments and in recent years has surpassed Japan, but on a cumulative basis, Japan still remains ahead in the region. The key word here is that Japan actually has built long established trust in the region. And there are expectations amongst ASEAN countries for Japan to remain for the long haul. And there is trust about Japan's own domestic record for growth. And I should add that Japan has been an inspiration for countries across Asia. In 1996, the World Bank came up with its seismic report called the East Asian Miracle, which was to justify some of the practices that had come under attack, especially from the United States, about industrial policy and strong private-public partnerships. But if we look at it today, we actually see that a lot of the strategies that had not only been key for the Asian tigers, including South Korea, Taiwan, Indonesia, to succeed, those are some of the practices that China has followed. And now the United States is also investing far more and putting more capital into its own industrial policy as well. So Japan as a model for growth as well as governance becomes clear under the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. But I would say that as we look forward, one of the biggest challenges for Japan's economic leadership in the region is to address some key cross-border issues, such as balancing growth with sustainability. We hear a lot in Japan about GX, right? The green transformation, decarbonization by 2050, the two carbon neutral goals that Japan has put forward. Those are great goals to have, but it does come under a lot of scrutiny from the global South. I don't actually like using the term global South, but it's shorthand for emerging markets that we use today. But Japan has a more practical approach to meeting some of the growth challenges as well as the environmental concerns. And I think that Japan can actually model some good, realistic behavior. And then finally, when we talk about realism, I would say that Japan is a champion for a more realist approach when it comes to managing economic challenges with China. JETRO, Japan's private trade relations organization, in its report that was released late last year, noted that Japanese companies invested 30% less in China in the latest year. But it's also interesting to note that less than 1% of Japanese companies actually retreated completely from China. So there is great awareness and action towards managing and dealing with the China challenge, but there's also no appetite really for Japanese companies to completely divest from China. For Japan to decouple from China was never going to be in the cards. But what Japan can offer is to provide opportunities and identify issues where countries have shared interests in dealing with the China challenge. And one of the more obvious areas that Japan can take a leadership role would be to push back against China's weaponizing of that economic dominance in the region. That is to say, economic coercion. I know that I don't have a lot of time here, and economic coercion is a big topic unto itself. It's become one of the top G7 agenda as well. But let me end with this thought. Can pushing back against economic coercion be the low-hanging fruit that unifies many Asian countries in pushing back against some of the Chinese threat? Or are there limitations for coercion, for having a policy towards economic coercion that is shared by Japan and America's allies and partners in the region? So let me conclude there.
Okay. Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And it is a great pleasure and privilege for me to participate in the FOIP event today. And I'd like to express my heartfelt gratitude to sponsors and organizers for holding this event at the so beautiful Japan Center in the center of Hollywood. And I wish I could stay here until the Academy Award to be held, Academy Award ceremony to be held next week. And in my presentation today, I'd like to focus on our economic dimensions of Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific FOIP. And in this context, I will answer 4 questions that the organizers have given me. The first question is, how are other countries in the Indo-Pacific region evaluating the economic dimensions of Japan's FOIP? And to answer this question, countries that Japan shares the FOIP norms with, such as the US, EU, Quad, and ASEAN, highly value the FOIP and are promoting cooperative efforts in economic dimension in cooperation with Japan. First, what is the economic dimension of the FOIP? The new FOIP plan announced by Prime Minister Kishida in March 2023 proposes 4 pillars, as was mentioned. And the economic dimensions of the plan are highlighted in red color. And with regard to the principles of peace and rules for prosperity, Japan has led the CPTPP negotiations after the US withdrawal from the TPP in 2017. In the IPEF, Japan has also served as a bridge between the US and developing countries, such as ASEAN. And in 2019, Japan compiled the G20 principles for quality infrastructure investment. In terms of addressing challenges in the Pacific way, the second pillar, the Global South is highly interested in addressing sustainability issues such as climate change, energy, and the environment, as well as complex crises such as development, food, and health. And economic resilience, including supply chains, is another important issue. Securing critical materials is essential in the face of pandemics and geopolitical upheaval. As for the third pillar, multi-layered connectivity, Japan is promoting the ASEAN-Japan Comprehensive Connectivity Initiative to support ASEAN's master plan on connectivity. And in the future, Japan will focus on strengthening connectivity between ASEAN and Southwest Asia, as well as connecting with the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, which was launched at the G20 summit last year. And Japan is cooperating with like-minded countries through bilaterals such as Japan and the US, and unilaterals such as Quad, and regional such as Japan, Europe, and Japan, ASEAN. And the content of cooperation reflects the interests of the like-minded countries. For example, in developed countries centered forums such as U.S. Japan, EU Japan, and Quad, the focus is on the agendas such as economic security, clean energy, and digital. In contrast, in developing country-centered cooperation with ASEAN, the focus is on the agendas such as connectivity and the SDGs, which address the challenges of developing countries. And I'd like to point out 3 issues that have been raised by other countries regarding the operation of the FOIP. First, FOIP is an incremental process and it's still in the process of being institutionalized. Second, there are regions where FOIP support has been inadequate at this moment, such as Central Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America. Third, to engage in the Global South, there may be a scope for further improving market access to developed countries and mobilizing financial support for infrastructure development in developing countries. And the second question is, are countries trying to balance their economic ties with Japan and China? The answer is that emerging and developing countries, especially those in what we call the Global South, are trying to balance their economic ties with Japan and China. And this can be rephrased as trying to strike a balance not only between Japan and China, but also between Japan, the US, and other Western developed countries, and China and Russia. And there's a difference in position between the Western countries, which emphasize principles and values such as human rights and democracy, and the developing countries, which are concerned with resolving issues such as overcoming poverty and economic growth. And the history of colonial rule and double standards in some area in the developed countries further widens this gap. In addition, China's Belt and Road Initiative and Russian military assistance contribute to the inclusion of the Global South. And against this background, countries in the Global South are trying to maintain a neutral position between 2 groups. And in particular, in terms of relations with Asia, Japan and China are both members of RCEP, but Japan and China have separately concluded FTAs with ASEAN, and Japan is also promoting CPTPP and IPEF. In terms of connectivity and clean energy, Japan has launched the ASEAN-Japan Comprehensive Connectivity Initiative and the ASEAN Asian Zero Emission Community Initiative, while China is promoting China Indo-China Economic Corridor under the Belt and Road Initiative and the BRI Green Development Initiative. At the same time, Japan and China have agreed to the G20 Quality Infrastructure Investment Principles and cooperating on infrastructure development, energy conservation, and environmental projects in third country markets. Asian countries are trying to take advantage of Japan's and China's free trade agreements and financial assistance initiatives. They are also trying to reap favorable results by having the 2 countries compete in large scale infrastructure construction, such as high-speed railway. And despite China's growing economic influence in Asia, Japan should use its high level of trust as a weapon to promote stronger economic ties with Asia. The third question is, broadly speaking, how does the region view the CPTPP, IPEF, and RCEP? The answer is that as a region, we view the CPTPP and RCEP as trade and investment liberalization initiatives based on globalization. While we view the IPEF as an initiative to develop rules for cooperation among like-minded countries in light of the geopolitical changes. The difference between the CPTPP and RCEP is that the CPTPP is a mega FTA centered on developed countries with higher standards in both market access and rules. The RCEP is a hybrid mega FTA involving both developed and developing countries, with ASEAN taking the lead in providing market access and rules that are more accommodating to developing countries. So some economists usually say CPTPP is a kind of university or graduate school, and RCEP is a kind of preparatory school. And as for the CPTPP, although the US has withdrawn from the CPTPP, many countries would like to see the US return to the CPTPP. This is because these countries look forward to the expanded access to the US market and US leadership on the issue of new members such as China and Taiwan. And China has applied to join the CPTPP, but it's widely seen as having difficulty meeting the CPTPP's high standards in areas such as market access, labor, e-commerce, and state-owned enterprises. As for RCEP, India has withdrawn from the negotiations, and I think it will be difficult for India to return because of its huge trade deficit with China, which has security issues. On the other hand, South Asian countries such as Bangladesh and Sri Lanka are strong candidates for new membership. This is because these countries have relatively large populations and markets, and they are also regional. They also have regional cooperation agreements with ASEAN, which is the core of RCEP. And as for IPEF, the key is to create a reliable supply chain network for critical materials such as semiconductors, critical minerals, and storage batteries in both peacetime and emergency situations through the supply chain agreement that has already been agreed upon. We also need to further coordinate with domestic stakeholders and developing countries to develop trade rules in areas as digital, labor, and the environment. Finally, the fourth question is there a regional appetite for Japan to play a larger economic role? The answer is that many countries, especially emerging and developing countries, believe that Japan should play a larger economic role. This chart shows the results of the Foreign Ministry's opinion poll on Japan by region. The US is not included in the current chart because the same question was not asked for the US. First, the percentage of respondents who answered very important or somewhat important to the question, how important do you think Japan's role is in stabilizing and growing the world economy, is quite high, especially in ASEAN, India, and Africa. And in the developed countries of Australia, Canada, and Europe, the percentage is relatively low, but still above 60%. And similar results were found for development cooperation, including ODA in the international community. And also similar results were seen in solution to global issues such as environment, climate change, infectious diseases, population, and poverty. And taken together, these results show that expectations for Japan are high in areas of the global south, where Japan makes economic contribution through ODA and private investment. Japan is highly trusted as a country, and its cooperation with developing countries on an equal partnership basis is highly appreciated. And the figures for developed countries such as Australia, the EU, and Canada are not as high as those for developing countries because they are not beneficiaries of the economic cooperation. but the percentage is still over 50% or 60%. Yeah, these countries are Japan's partners in mega FTAs, such as CPTPP and RCEP, and Japan has many opportunities to cooperate with them in providing assistance to emerging and developing countries. So expectations for Japan's role are high. So that concludes my presentation. And thank you very much for your attention.
All right. Thank you, all of you. That was wonderful. I'm going to, like the previous panels, I'm going to kick off with questions and then I'll open it up both here in the audience as well as online. Let me start with a question for both Howard and Shihoko, and then a separate question for Kunihiko. So in the presentations, a lot was discussed about Japan taking the lead on CPTPP, the US promoting IPEF. Does this difference in terms of leadership roles, does this matter for the success of FOIP? Like, is it going to hamper FOIP in any way if you have Japan doing CPTPP, the US doing IPEF, or does it support each other in some ways? For Kunihiko, the question I have for you is this discrepancy between Japan supporting one and the US supporting the other. How do other countries view that? And particularly, if you have any thoughts about how China views that difference, I'd be curious. So let's start, if you don't mind, Howard, if I could start with you.
Thanks, Jeffrey. I don't think it matters for success because FOIP for both countries is multifaceted, whereas IPEF and CPTPP are much more focused on economic issues. In some ways, it's good that Japan has taken the lead on CPTPP because there is always a chance that at some point the United States will once again re-engage with market access. And I don't know why, but this is like exactly the perfect case. I was thinking about this earlier today. I spent, back in 2005, I spent 3 weeks in Japan, only time, traveled all around, and I was there for Hurricane Katrina, okay? And just by luck, I went to the Kyoto rail station and there was a Café du Monde serving beignets. And I realized I am about the only American in the world who can have a beignet right now. And that kind of is a good metaphor, right? When the US is not able to do something or not willing to do something, Japan has stepped up as a supplier in this case. And in this case, it's a supplier of trade deal that has market access. But all the other dimensions of FOIP, connectivity, supply chains, freedom of navigation, that's independent of the countries taking these tasks.
So if CPTPP were simply a trade agreement, then I would completely agree with Howard. However, the looming issue is that which deals with the politics of the region. Unlike USMCA, which is closed, it's never about expansion. CPTPP has deliberately been structured so that it is open to new memberships. So not only do you have countries like China, and I know Taiwan's not a country, but Taiwan, we also have Ukraine, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Uruguay applying, officially expressing their interest to join the CPTPP. Now, we don't know what the real motivation for China to join CPTPP is or not. We could say that, yes, this is actually an opportunity for China to be part of the rules-based order, and that we should encourage Beijing to be part of the system. Others would argue that no, this is a deliberate way for China to drive a wedge amongst the current member countries and to deliberately take away some of the time and effort that in moving CPTPP forward in a constructive way. Now, there are clear ways for CPTPP to measure whether countries are qualify for accession or not. One is whether they actually abide by the high standards that's set. Another is whether they have a track record in adhering to those measures. And then thirdly, whether there is consensus amongst the member countries to ensure that that country can join. China, in all three of these, is extremely controversial. And so its interest can be questioned. And I believe that Tokyo would certainly question some of the motivation behind Beijing. And then, of course, there is that Taiwan element. And again, this is a trade agreement, but it's going to be very difficult for Taiwan to join before China for political reasons. The United States, even though it was the IPEF is Washington's baby, it's the Biden administration's initiative. And you see all these members of Congress going to Taiwan and expressing America's support for Taiwan, and yet even it could not have Taiwan join IPEF, and it had to do a separate bilateral economic framework for the 21st century initiative for Taiwan. So even Washington finds it very difficult to ensure that other countries would accept Taiwan as a member of any existing economic framework. So the conclusion is that this would be a divisive issue. And I would argue that for the CPTPP, with its limited resources and capacity to actually deal with this, it would probably be more prudent to push this down the line, because it will take up a lot of energy and a lot of consensus building for any of this to move forward.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I think so. Most of the Indo-Pacific countries strongly hope that United States will come back to CPTPP because they like United States to continue to be the leader of the free trade in Asia-Pacific, Indo-Pacific region. And they highly expect the improved market access to the U.S. market. And also they believe that United States can be a good solver of the issues of the Chinese entry into CPTPP. At the same time, these countries think IPEF can be a kind of 21st century type regional economic architecture, which can cope with the geopolitical upheavals such as U.S.-China U.S.-China strategic competition. And IPEF is a kind of incubator of the new trade routes on digital environment labor. And they finally came up with the supply chain agreement. And I think, most of the countries strongly hope that United States will accelerate the negotiation on the first pillar of trade in that early manner. And with regard to the China's position, I think China would like to join CPTPP without the presence of the United States and take the lead in regional economic integration in Asia-Pacific region. And China would like to expand its own supply chain with its major trade partners with the help of CPTPP. And as for the IPEF, China might feel that it is excluded from membership of the IPEF.
So let me ask one more question before turning to the audience. We've heard a lot today from all panels about the dimensions of FOIP being about rule of law. We've heard in this panel about free trade, status quo. Recently, there was the story about the sale of US steel to Nippon Steel. This caused a tremendous amount of criticism in Washington, D.C. In some ways, I would argue this is, when we're talking about our countries cooperating or free trade, rule of law, this is the perfect example in some ways of friendshoring. I know it's a sale, but it's friendshoring. Question I have for anybody or all of you, whoever wants to take this, what went wrong with that? And it's not, I don't believe it's over yet, but what happened there? And the more important question is, does that provide any lessons we should be thinking about in terms of like the economic dimensions of FOIP moving forward and any potential challenges that we might see? Today, we're talking a lot about cooperation, but does this expose potential differences between the US and Japan when we're talking about FOIP? Let me start with Goto-san. If you have any questions, I don't want to always go straight to the person next to me, but.
Yeah. So what went wrong? What went wrong? Timing and naming. This is a US presidential year, and the name is U.S. Steel. If it were Horning and Company, and if it were 2 years ago, there would have been no problem selling this steel manufacturer, I don't think. In terms of global ranking, US Steel doesn't even make the top 20. It is not a big steel player, and the United States is trying to enhance its US steel making capabilities. And it goes back to your logic about this would be a perfect way for two countries committed to working together to invest in critical industries. At a time when China dominates in the steel manufacturing industry, and I would say that it would also be an opportunity for Japan and the United States to work together with India to have greater capabilities to compete head on with Chinese steel dominance in the world. But this being a presidential year, and I know Howard would have more to say about this, but the key state, it's based in Pennsylvania, which is a swing state. And the US, and just one other thing, I get very emotional about this, but the legacy of US Steel, it's a very storied company that has Carnegie as its founder, right? And it really as we talk about making, reinvesting in the United States, investing in US manufacturing, it kind of is at the baseline of the history of US manufacturing and US economic competitiveness in the 19th and 20th century. But I think the challenge, of course, is that is not reflected in the reality. And then this whole idea of going through CFIUS, it shouldn't have any problems about going through those security concerns. But from a political dimension, it is very difficult. Just one other thing before I turn back to you. The labor unions are against it. But my understanding is that there has been some way forward for the labor unions to negotiate on a non-disclosure aspect to move forward with this agreement, when that may be, whether it's before or after the election. The hope is that it would be before the election, but let me kind of wrap it up there.
I want to build on that a little bit because Jeffrey mentioned that I'd spent a year as a senior economist at Council of Economic Advisors. At the time, I was our representative to the working group of CFIUS. Now, this was an earlier iteration of CFIUS. That's the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States It's chaired by Treasury. It looks at foreign acquisitions of US companies from a national security perspective, only national security. And the political aspect, so Jeffrey, to you, this is a test in some ways. And the test is the political aspect. Should we allow a foreign company to buy US steel? Right? And Pennsylvania matters as well. Right? That is a political aspect. The committee actually can't confirm that it's in the committee. US law, no one involved in CFIUS is allowed to say what companies filed. So for example, I can't talk about any cases that we saw, but I can talk about process. And process is it's interagency. It has been that the committee members truly do look from a purely national security perspective. And the process can be quite long and drawn out. There are rules about how long a review takes. There are rules about how long an investigation takes. That can be rolled over, right? You can withdraw the case temporarily and then put it back. The companies involved have teams of very good, very high-priced lawyers. In Washington, there is what is called the CFIUS bar. The CFIUS lawyers know the members of CFIUS, so there's discussion. A case file is developed, and this could take quite a while. That's the first thing. The second thing is there are ways for these mergers or acquisitions to happen where there are things that are carved out. So there's something called a mitigation agreement. It might involve, with something sensitive, it might involve that the foreign buyers are not allowed to go into some parts of a company. It may be that the company has to hire a security officer and start, some kind of process to safeguard intellectual property. So there are all kinds of things to do. In the end, there's also an issue of political leadership. Can you explain to people, are the political authorities in a bipartisan way willing and able to explain why this merger is being allowed to go through or not? And there are some things that never went through that could have gone through. So if you remember in like 05 or 06, China National Offshore Oil Company wanted to buy Chevron, I think, and that was just completely stopped at the White House. I don't even think that got to CFIUS. Another case, though, that was very politically salient, but that people don't think about anymore, is when Lenovo bought the IBM ThinkPad line of computers, right? And we just don't think about that anymore. That proved to be very beneficial for IBM and not at all harmful to the United States. So the case to be made with Nippon Steel, US Steel, is what is the status of US Steel if the acquisition does not take place? And this is where politicians are going to have to explain what is the status, what does Nippon Steel bring in terms of intellectual property, market share, investment. And so it is still in play. It is a test, but I wouldn't say that things have gone wrong yet because it's in play.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I'm not so quite familiar with this case, but yeah, US Steel is a symbol of the core manufacturing industry in the US, and Nippon's the merger and acquisition of the US Steel by Nippon Steel would be politicized in the year of the presidential election in 2024. And I think, Japan should promote a kind of public relations activities to appeal the spillover effect of this merger and acquisition on the employment or technology cooperation. And so this kind of merger and acquisition should strengthen the competitiveness of the US steel industry. This kind of explanation is needed. And I don't know if we can say this is a kind of friend shoring activities or not, but but I'm very much impressed by your word, friend shoring.
All right, let's turn to the audience. Do we have any questions? Yes, in the middle there.
Earlier, there was mention of economic coercion from China. I was wondering, part of the recommendation, I think, was, excuse me if I misheard, was that there needs to be, there's the potential to push back against economic coercion. But what realistically, what would that look like? And what would be China's reaction to pushback?
Actually, so countermeasures against economic coercion by China is one of the most important issue which was discussed at the G7 Hiroshima summit. And G7 countries decided to establish a kind of coordination mechanism to counter the economic coercions. And the United States and the EU has also enacted a kind of provisions to take countermeasures against this kind of economic coercion by helping some countries damaged by the economic coercion, or to take strong countermeasures against China. And I think in some cases, global South countries like Philippines or Mongol are also suffered from the economic coercion taken by China. For example, China imports import restrictions on the banana imported from Philippines, and Mongol was also suffered from the economic coercion by China on the importation of the critical minerals. So I think there should be a collaboration between G7 countries and global South countries on the countermeasures against China.
Just one thing quickly. The goal is, there are two goals. One is to deter China from taking coercive action in the first instance. And then the second goal would be to take punitive action against China when coercive actions are taken. So on the first, there has been a lot of discussion about economic coercion in recent years. But at the same time, as time has gone on, there's also a recognition that it hasn't actually hurt the broader economy either. That is to say that China is also very deliberate in what it decides to target. It's not going to shoot itself in the foot. So it might stop importing Australian wine, but it's not going to stop importing Australian minerals, right? So is there a way of having a collective defense mechanism? And one of the earlier suggestions had been about having an economic form of collective economic alliance in the form of NATO, that an attack on one is an attack on all. The conclusion is that that's not going to be possible. The other issue is, well, if one country is attacked, is there a possibility for other countries to pool together and support that country? And the United States would always often uses the example of Lithuania supporting Lithuania when it came under attack from China. That's possible too, but it is quite difficult to do when it's a bigger country on a larger scale. The conclusion is that although there has been this tremendous support to push forward on economic, to have collective resilience against economic coercion, that it's not always easy to have a roadmap. My argument is that this is as much raising public awareness of Chinese economic coercion. So as much as it's an economic action by China, the response could also be about collective awareness, public campaigning, and public support towards the country that is coming under attack. And as we talk about values and interests shared amongst the FOIP countries, that it alienates China even further from that rules-based order. And it's easy to understand, right? If China's not buying Filipino bananas, then there's greater public awareness of how outrageous that movement is. So we can have like a groundswell of support in pushing back against coercive measures. So it's not as easy to come up with a roadmap against coercion as it is to articulate that coercion is a problem. Thanks.
So let me turn to the online audience. Could you ask a question from the online audience?
Yeah, so one question is, how can the US and Japan work better together to help promote a more long-term perspective or interpretation of the concept of free and open Indo-Pacific in these various economic agreements?
I go first, Howard. Sort of how US and Japan can work better together to try to towards economic agreements or.
So how can the US and Japan work better together to help promote a more long-term perspective or interpretation of the concept of FOIP in these various agreements?
That's not an easy question. And I'm sure that right now people in Tokyo and Washington are thinking about the same thing and not really coming up with very good answers. So long-term buy-in, I think with anything is going to come if the target countries or the target region actually benefits from it, right? Ultimately, everybody is going to weigh, every country is going to weigh, where is our future better? Where are we safer? Where are we more prosperous? Largely within Japan, US, EU, Canada, UK, ASEAN, free and open Pacific framework, or something else. I think and this may be being done now, right? But what could be helpful is coordination to see whether there are gaps, whether there are spoilers being created or countries being left out. For example, one of the very interesting things from Japan is I'm gonna get this a little bit wrong in the terminology, but the economic and industrial zone of Bay of Bengal, northern India, right? Which is quite an interesting idea in terms of bringing the benefits of global engagement, free and open Indo-Pacific, to a somewhat neglected area, right? So that's Japan stepping up to a neglected area. Are there other neglected areas, or is there an area that the US could be better at? And I would actually broaden that. The question was, how can US and Japan work together, given that we have most of the advanced industrial countries signed on to the concept, right? Can there be greater coordination among all of them? Because in the end, where the benefit is going to lie, and again, the target region has to benefit, in the end, where the benefit lies is engaging with, if you include EU, all of the G7 and others, engaging with a majority of the global economy. And even if the US doesn't improve market access, it's still a very good import market. So these are highly influential economies. So I would, US and Japan, I would conclude, as I've thought through this, more careful attention to what's being left out, making sure that areas are not left out. But beyond that, kind of widening coordination to every other major region that has an open Indo-Pacific strategy as well.
So the areas for economic cooperation between the United States and Japan are many, and the most exciting ones and where the highest stakes are in the advanced technology sphere. And that's really to come up with the pioneer in establishing the rules so that they can actually continue to lead the way to secure innovation in those fields. Now, that does not necessarily include emerging markets. And so the challenge of that is to say, well, where can the cooperation between the United States and Japan on these critical industries lead to growth in across Southeast and South Asia as well. And I look, for instance, at the critical minerals sector, and we have bilateral, multilateral agreements in those industries. But it is what the emerging markets are looking for is to be able to move up the middle income trap as well. And so opportunities to encourage that kind of not just exploitative natural resource trade, but using this rethink of supply chain resiliency, especially, for instance, in the semiconductor sector, which is incredibly complex, to ensure that countries in Southeast Asia in particular become an integral part on a higher side, not just in packaging and testing, which is on the lower end, but also even in something as sophisticated as design, as well as manufacturing, and whether Japan and the United States can join together in not just investing in the infrastructure for that, but also, as we know, one of the biggest issues right now is workforce development, whether they can actually build up human capital in those advanced technologies across emerging markets will be something that both countries, it would be in their own country's interests as well.
Yeah, United States and Japan has established many kind of coordination mechanism or cooperation framework, such as the 2+2 economic policy consultation, or U.S. Japan core partnership, or climate change cooperation framework. And with the use of these frameworks, two countries can discuss some important economic issues like economic security, clean energy, energy security, supply chain resilience, or DFFT. And they can expand this economic cooperation towards some like-minded countries, not only within G7, but also in the global South countries. For example, with regard to the infrastructure development, G7 and some global South countries can work together on the infrastructure development with the use of the platform for global investment, global infrastructure investment, PGII. Or so with regard to the supply chain, I think United States can utilize the Quad or IPEF or G7 and global South to enhance the supply chain in the so critical minerals or semiconductors or other critical materials.
Yes, we have one question over here.
Hi, thanks so much again, and thank you to the great panelists. So my question, when it comes to the intersection between Japan's FOIP strategy and economics, I'm wondering how much of a threat current economic anxieties might be to the implementation of Japan's strategy. I think of a lot of concerns still about inflation in the United States, a lot of economic concerns in China, and we've seen some relatively bleak economic data from Japan the last 2 quarters. So I'm wondering, are these economic anxieties a threat to Japan's strategy, or are they going to force Japan to modify that strategy?
Let me take the first stab. So from a pure Japan's economic standing perspective, the weaker the Japanese economy, the less that Japan can contribute to development assistance, right? And there will be less public support. So that's one area where there's a definite impact. But I also want to point out some of the challenges that Japan is having, going back to this idea of human capital. The yen is weak. Japan has a demography issue, right? There's like domestic issues from, and the graying society is one of them. A win-win had been emerging of having Southeast Asian and South Asian nationals come to Japan and work, especially in the the less urban areas, right? They don't want to come anymore, oftentimes, because if they're going to go out and make money overseas, then the Japanese yen has become weak. So when they go back to repatriate, the value of their repatriated money is not as high as it once used to be, and they can go to other countries. What we are also seeing, I haven't really seen real data on this yet, but it has come to the attention where it's seen as a trend where Japanese nationals are actually going to Southeast Asia, especially places like Singapore and Thailand, to go work, not to go on holiday, which was the usual thing to do, or not to go as expats, but they actually go to work and they actually see more economic opportunities. That's one issue. And I want to also point this out. Japan has been at the forefront of developing economic security measures, including adopting economic security legislation. One key concern for Japan is to ensure its continued economic resilience at home. And so it will continue to focus on domestic economic growth and protecting its own innovation capacities, and as well as thinking about the China challenge and the like. So there are, and that domestic challenge is not necessarily the same as that are expressed in the United States. So that's one key difference.
Yeah, I understand there's a concern about the deterioration of the Japanese economy and the medium and long term. So there are some phenomena such as the depreciation of yen or shrinking Japanese market because of the declining birth rate, aging society with declining birth rate. That's why recently Japanese Economic Association started a campaign to penetrate the foreign market, which will rapidly be growing in Asia. And actually under the free and open Indo-Pacific initiative, Japan tried to expand its private investment, not only in Northeast Asia or Southeast Asia, but India. In the future, we have to target Southwestern Asia or Africa, whose population will grow rapidly in the future. And for that purpose, we try to enhance the policy effort to strengthen this connectivity between Southeast Asia and Southwestern Asia, or facilitate the supply chain between these two areas in the future.
I will add that this is a good example. Your question is a good example of the value of the complementarities between the US and Japan. I'm not in any position, I defer to my colleagues about whether this is a threat to Japan's strategy, but should somehow Japan recede in any way, the US effort on the free and open Indo-Pacific is not that politically controversial and is sustainable. And that may be kind of the one saving grace of the trade pillar not involving market access. Nobody is getting hurt in the US from this. And the IPEF pillars 2, 3, and 4 are all to the benefit of the US. Freedom of navigation is to the benefit of the US. It's broadly bipartisan policy to ensure that China is not a spoiler. So this is a case where should, in any case, Japan recede at all, the US policy, we've had tremendous continuity, and it should continue to move on like this. And so I think we'll see kind of a longer term support from all of the countries to some degree or another for the free and open Indo-Pacific idea.
So with that, I will close this panel. If you could please join me in thanking our panelists. sit back down, let me bring our day event to a close. This has been a really enlightening event. There was a lot of good discussions today. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank our keynote speakers. Many of them left. They are very busy people. But I want to thank our keynote speakers, our panelists, our co-hosts, Consulate General of Japan, as well as the Japan House, Los Angeles. Thank you very much. Thank you for all the audience members, both here and online, for sticking around. Importantly, I want to thank a lot of the people that helped make this day happen. The AV people, our colleagues in the back, colleagues up here, the people who kept us fed, kept hot coffee in our cups. Thank you. So let me offer some final thoughts to close out everything that we've heard today. Despite FOIP being created during the Abe administration, its continual strength and influence represents arguably one of Japan's greatest strategic achievements, which at its very core is an effort to shape and maintain the current rules-based regional order. Contained in FOIP is a mix of cooperation, competition, but not a direct naming of what FOIP seeks to target. Rather, it's a direct naming of what FOIP seeks to support. And we've heard a lot about FOIP today. I took some notes here. FOIP helps us maintain the status quo. It is a means to enhance connectivity based on the rule of law. It's a way to address the regional challenges. It's inclusive. It fosters diversity. It is a positive vision, and it is adaptive. But to me, the thing that stands out above everything else about what FOIP is the fact that the terminology and the underlying idea has been copied and replicated in other countries, including the United States. In other words, FOIP has proved critical for shaping the Indo-Pacific region and the way that regional states and actually states around the world engage the region. And as emphasized throughout this conference, Japan and the United States look to each other in this endeavor, supporting each other's efforts. So this partnership and this idea, this has been central to our objective at the conference today. We wanted to showcase the strength of the U.S.-Japan alliance by focusing on the challenges facing the region and the efforts by the alliance to face them, both in the security domain and in the economic domain. Japan's conceptualization of a strategic concept to support the existing regional order, I think, is truly an underappreciated line of effort. Our conference here today helped shed some light on much needed attention on it, so that Japan's efforts and those of the U.S.-Japan alliance are better understood. When looking ahead to the future, as researchers and analysts and officials in both these countries, as we look to our counterparts across the Pacific Ocean and beyond, I believe there's a strong foundation for the U.S. and Japan to continue in our shared efforts, and like the title of this conference, to work together to realize a free and open Indo-Pacific region. So let me close and thank everyone again for attending, and thank all of you who helped make this possible. I want to remind all of you, we will be sending out a survey at the end of this event in your email box, 2-minute survey to just gauge your interest in future topics. We would be very grateful to have you fill that out. Finally, we've had a lot of really deep theoretical policy things in our mind. You have a chance to cleanse it all. I would remind all of you that on the second floor, there is a Japan House exhibit. It is Design Museum Japan. It's open until 7. I had a chance 2 days ago to look inside. It's wonderful. And so when you go down on the second floor, you'll see a coffee shop sort of on the corner. Take a left there, just right around the corner. And it's a wonderful exhibit to see on your way out today. But thank all of you for coming to join us, and safe travels home. Thank you.